Before we go on, I want to talk a little more, quote Franklin a little more, because he's also got this great account of his relationship, his personal relationship with Whitefield. Upon one of his arrivals from England at Boston, he wrote to me that he should come soon to Philadelphia, but knew not where he could lodge when there, as he understood his old kind host, Mr. Benezet, was removed to Germantown. My answer was, "You know my house. If you can make shift with its scanty accommodations, you will be most heartily welcome." He replied that if I made that kind offer for Christ's sake, I should not miss a reward. And I returned, "Don't let me be mistaken. It was not for Christ's sake, but for your sake." That is so much Franklin. He's always in this world. Don't put me off to the next world. This is for you in this world. I'm being useful. I'm not being religious. One of our common acquaintances jokingly remarked that, knowing it to be the custom of the saints when they received any favor to shift the burden of obligation from off their own shoulders and place it in heaven, I had contrived to fix it on earth. And that is exactly right. Franklin is always on earth. His feet are always on the solid ground. He's always concerned with the here and now. And then one more thing, talking about his relationship with Whitefield. We had no religious connection. He used indeed sometimes to pray for my conversion, but never had the satisfaction of believing that his prayers were heard. Ours was a mere civil friendship, sincere on both sides, and lasted to his death. Just shows you so much about Franklin and Whitefield. They have this, profound religious disagreement, but they were sincerely good friends and friends for life. It tells you a lot about, I think, Franklin's talent for friendship. So Franklin's a very unusual figure, as we've discussed. Let's talk about what religious people thought of Whitefield, because that tells us a lot as well. In 1740, Whitefield went to New England. He did the Middle Colonies in 1739. In 1740, he goes to New England the next year. And this thing about Franklin worrying about how many people could hear Whitefield at once, there's a real reason for that. And the reason is that Whitefield spoke to enormous crowds. In his period in Philadelphia, it's estimated he spoke to 30,000 people in 1739. In 1740, when he goes to Boston, he speaks to 19,000 people. It's amazing. And to me, the most remarkable thing about that statistic is that the population of Boston in 1740 was only 15,000. So virtually everyone in eastern Massachusetts who could come hear George Whitefield speak did. He was a phenomenon. He's really the first mass phenomenon in American history, where thousands and thousands of people show up. 80,000 people show up to an NFL game today, and it's, ho-hum, it's just another game. We're used to enormous crowds, but they weren't. They're from a much smaller, much more rural society. And the fact that he could draw thousands and thousands of people showed what a phenomenon he was. Well, in 1740, he works his way south through New England and is in Connecticut in October. And we have this account of him coming to Middletown, Connecticut, which is right off the Connecticut River, south of Hartford on the map here. And here's an account from someone very unlike Benjamin Franklin. This is a simple religious farmer. His name was Nathan Cole. "Now it pleased God to send Mr. Whitefield into this land. I longed to see and hear him and wished he would come this way. Then, on a sudden, in the morning, about 8 or 9 of the clock, there came a messenger and said, Mr. Whitefield preached at Hartford and Wethersfield yesterday and is to preach at Middletown this morning at 10 of the clock." Okay, so we see it on the map here. He's working his way south down the Connecticut River, first Hartford, then Wethersfield, and on his way to Middletown. Another interesting thing that this account tells us is that Mr. Whitefield has advanced runners now. There's this messenger going around like Paul Revere telling people where Whitefield's going to be. And it certainly works on Nathan Cole. "I was in my field at work. I ran home to my wife, telling her to make ready quickly to go and hear Mr. Whitefield preach at Middletown. Then run to my pasture for my horse with all my might. When we came within about half a mile or a mile of the road that comes down from Hartford, Wethersfield, and Stepney to Middletown, there's a road that follows the Connecticut River. On high land, I saw before me a cloud or fog rising. I first thought it came from the great river, but as I came nearer the road, I heard a noise, something like a low rumbling thunder, and presently found it was the noise of horses' feet coming down the road, and this cloud was a cloud of dust made by the horses' feet. It arose some rods into the air over the tops of hills and trees, and when I came within about 20 rods of the road, I could see men and horses slipping along in the cloud like shadows. And as I drew nearer, it seemed like a steady stream of horses and their riders, scarcely a horse more than his length behind another, all of a lather and foam with sweat, their breath rolling out of their nostrils every jump. Every horse seemed with all his might to carry his rider to hear news from heaven for the saving of souls. It made me tremble to see the sight, how the world was in a struggle. So Mr. Cole sees this big crowd along this road, and there's all this dust and everything. The horses are all excited. The horses have never been in a crowd this big either, and they can sense the excitement of the people. Everybody's all keyed up. When we got to Middletown Old Meeting House, there was a great multitude. It was said to be 3,000 or 4,000 of people. That's probably the biggest crowd he'd ever been in his life. When I saw Mr. Whitefield come upon the scaffold, they erected a stage for him. When I saw Mr. Whitefield come upon the scaffold, he looked almost angelical. Or maybe he's on the scaffold they used to hang people. He looked almost angelical, a young, slim, slender youth. He's 26 in 1740. Before some thousands of people with a bold, undaunted countenance. And my hearing how God was with him everywhere as he came along, it solemnized my mind and put me in a trembling fear before he began to preach. For he looked as if he was clothed with authority from the great God, and a sweet, solemn solemnity sat upon his brow. And my hearing him preach gave me a heart wound by God's blessing. My old foundation was broken up, and I saw that my righteousness would not save me. So, a couple of things here. Mr. Cole is so excited by the whole scene that Whitefield doesn't even need to say a word, and he's ready to fall at his feet. He gets up. He's used to enormous crowds at this point. Speaking in Middletown, Connecticut, it's nothing. He was doing it yesterday in Hartford. So he's used to this thousands of people, and Mr. Cole is trembling before Whitefield says a word. His reputation at that point is so great that he's a phenomenon just by showing up. He's one of the earliest celebrities in America, another way to think of it. And then the last thing I want you to note is the last sentence. My old foundation was broken up, and I saw that my righteousness would not save me. That type of religious language we still hear in America. That's the language of heart religion, and that's what Whitefield is preaching. That you got to feel God in your heart. That that religion is an emotional experience. That your old ways, your old knowledge, your old foundation of your life has to break up and start again, and you have to be born again. We're seeing the origins of this in Connecticut in 1740. Well, that leads us to some unintended consequences. And a lot of these have to do with the awakening and authority. Let's look at New Haven, Connecticut. This is the New Haven Green in New Haven, Connecticut. That's Yale University in the background there, the Gothic-looking buildings. But we're going to concentrate on the green and the two churches in the center and on the right. Now, the church on the left is Episcopal. That would have been built when the Church of England asserted its authority. When a governor would have appointed from London, he would have needed a church to worship in. The church in the middle is the First Church in Connecticut. There it is. And that's called the First Church of Christ in the Green, in New Haven Center Church on the Green. The reason it's called the First Church is because it was the first church. That building isn't the first building, obviously, but it's on the same spot. And that church has a crypt in the basement with all of these old graves in it from the 1630s and 40s. And you can see that the church was founded in 1638 when New Haven's founded. And they've been in that spot since 1638, and that church was built between 1812 and 1814. So that is the church. That's the Puritan church in New Haven. That's where they settled, that's where they worshiped, that's where they built their first church, and there's been a continuous congregation there since. Next to it, almost close enough to throw a rock to, is, this is the first church again, the Center Church. Here's the one next to it, the United Church, also built between 1812 and 1814. They probably had a little rivalry going. These churches are very similar looking from the outside. You really have to pay attention to the architecture to see the differences. And here's this other church, the United Church. Now, why is that there? Why have a second church built just hundreds of feet away from the first church in New Haven? And the answer is the Great Awakening, because the unintended consequence of the Great Awakening is to split the churches. Here's what happens. George Whitefield comes to town. People like Mr. Cole get all excited about him. And then he leaves. He leaves within hours. He's on to the next town. What happens next? Well, what happens next is the people who feel like Mr. Cole, that their foundations have been broken up and that they've discovered this new heart religion, they can't go back to the old church anymore. When they do, it seems stifling and boring and repressed and mistaken. They've seen a new light, and that's why they become known as the New Lights. And what happens is that not everybody agrees with them. And in town after town, they begin to argue about what type of preaching they should have, what type of church they should be. And they can't reconcile. Some people stay with the way things were, and some people want to go with the new way. And this leads to some nasty fights. Churches split. Who owns the old building? Who's in the majority? Should the minister be fired? One of the social consequences of the Great Awakening is the schism, the splitting of the churches in New England. And it's a very nasty town-by-town argument. There's a diary left by a woman named Mary Fish. Mary Fish's father was a preacher in Connecticut in 1740 when his church split because of the Great Awakening between New Lights and Old Lights. He was an Old Light. And Mary Fish writes in her diary about how the family went cold that winter because people would bring firewood to the minister's house. Half the congregation stopped doing that. The Fishes had half the wood they had the year before, and they nearly froze with inadequate firewood. So that's the sort of personal consequence of the Great Awakening that happened. That it's a very, very personal thing in town after town after town. Here's Milford, Connecticut, split between the Old Light and the New Light churches. These churches are, again, a couple hundred yards apart, and they stay split for over 100 years, between 1740 and 1926. New Lights tended to be poorer. This new revivalistic religion tended to appeal more to the poor. Another consequence of the awakening in both Old Light and New Light churches is that women become more prominently involved in the church. And the heart religion, the revivalistic religion, appeals more to women. And we'll talk about that more later in the semesters. As women become really the moral center of the family, it takes 2 or 3 generations, but it starts with the Great Awakening. Dad stops being the one to read the Bible and teach you your prayers, and mom starts to be the one to do that. So the awakening has a lot of unexpected consequences. I think the most profound, though, is the undermining of authority. And here's what I mean by that. If there's one minister in town, and everybody goes to the same church, and nobody's ever really questioned the way the minister does things or the importance of his education or anything like that, and suddenly that all changes. There are now 2 churches in town. There are people there are people questioning whether this minister is a good minister. There's somebody preaching in a different style. That means that the kind of automatic deflection to the authority of the minister is gone. You don't have to unthinkingly obey the minister in spiritual matters anymore because there's somebody else. In fact, you have to actively decide which church you're going to go to. And the result of that is the undermining of all ministerial authority. People begin to say, you know what, I don't like the way you do things. I don't believe what you believe. I don't think you're any better, any more of a spiritual authority than I am. And the net result of that is Americans get used to, for lack of a better term, questioning authority. And I think that is an incredibly important precursor to the American Revolution. Okay? The implication for the Revolution is that Americans get used to deciding for themselves. I argue that that's the case anyway for government. They get used to governing themselves. We talked about colonial assemblies. We made that point. But I think just as important, maybe more important, is that Americans get used to not automatically deferring to authority. They don't automatically say, oh, this person's richer than I am, or from a more important family, or they went to Harvard. The awakening undermines that, and undermines that profoundly. The American Revolution isn't going to take place for a generation and a half, but the groundwork has been laid in a very, very important way. And I'll see you next time, and we'll start talking about the origins of the American Revolution then.